clip it on you when you walk up. Is this microphone working? I guess it is. Good evening and welcome to the lecture series, the Summer 82 lecture series. This is the Southern California Institute of Architecture, for some of you who are trying to forget. Tonight's lecture, the series is on environmental and planning perspectives for architects, and generally focusing on some pretty social issues. And highlights things to come will be next week we're having, of course tonight's called 2,500 years of solar architecture and technology. Next 2 weeks from now, June 16th, will be urban design, visionary architecture for the city. And on June 30th we have Jim Burns, who's going to give a lecture called Take Part, How to Involve People in Designing Their Environments. And then July 14th, the last of the four, we have the lectures entitled Atomic Cafe and Furniture for a Nuclear Crisis. And the furniture competition was being conducted right now, and hopefully we'll get a lot of entries for you people who are trying to design some amazing structural systems that will hold up a nuclear holocaust, live through a nuclear holocaust. Tonight, first I want to thank some of the people who have been involved in getting this together. Carlos Savalle, who always is anonymous, and I wish he was more anonymous. And particularly Rosemary Robin, who's not only does she put up with the 300 students at SCI-Arc and 20 faculty who also give her a pain in the neck, but also certain people who like to come in to work with their hair blue, and who will remain anonymous. Can you see Rick? Maybe not enough light in here. Okay, yeah. Put a black light on Rick's head and you'll see him for 100 miles away. Let me see. Some of the things that we talked about tonight, hopefully, are the paradox between low and high technology, and just the terminology we use for low technology. That thing, the gossamer condor that flew across the English Channel was considered low technology, and things like the Concorde are considered high technology. And there's a real paradox there in just our terminology and the way we relate to these things, because obviously there's a hell of a lot of brain power required in designing something that is virtually a bicycle that will fly across the English Channel. And I don't know how much brain power or confusion it requires to make something like the Concorde that might have been some people might call it a disaster. Me, for example. There's kind of a social significance that ties into this, and we've been in the meism kind of age where everything's been me, and there's all these mind-expanding theories of social and awareness, mind awareness, and the meism kind of connects with this high technology thing and in a more abstract sense. And hopefully we'll be moving away from the high technology meism age and moving into more of a low technology us-ism, where everybody is important, not just me or you or anybody else. Ken Butti's given lectures in England and France, Spain, Germany, Japan, and China about solar energy, proving that the sun doesn't only rise in Southern California, which some of us might protest. He recently wrote a book called A Golden Thread, 2,500 Years of Solar Architecture and Technology, which is the title of tonight's lecture. I give to you Ken Butti. Thank you. Oops. This is technology. Oops.
Okay. Testing. Okay, yes, it works.
Testing. Okay. Can we work out this technology? Yeah.
Okay.
Stick in your pocket.
All right. Welcome to Ray's Garage. For all of your this is a product of the school here, I think. I think it speaks for itself. As very, very low technology, very functional. There's probably cardboard underneath there. As Mark was saying, an aspect of the discussion. I've seen it titled in various spots around the school as 2,500 years of architecture, 5,000, 6,000. It's actually 6,000. And what I really want to talk about is that solar has sort of fallen into the category of trend. It was a nice idea. It was really quite a sexy idea maybe 5 years ago, and it's an all right idea now for a few architects, and now that we're in an energy glut, well, who cares? And so really what I wanted to show is that every major civilization, every major period in history, most indigenous architecture, most of the homes built, have incorporated climate design, and specifically the use of the sun. So it's much more than a trend, and I think some very interesting things that come out of that. So I really want to broaden the perspective that most people have toward this type of architecture. And with that, there are many other things inherent. The whole idea of low, simple technology versus a high, complicated technology. And a way in which a very elegant system of design, accomplishing a great deal by using an acute awareness of the environment around us and the materials in which we use. So what I want to do is really look at the major areas of the world. First we'll start in Asia, then in Europe, and then here in the United States, North America, and hopefully surprise a few people with how much we've used the sun. This is our post-war couple here. This is a solar home built in the 40s. A good number of these homes are built in the northern part of the United States and are still lived in today. This is our post-war couple. This is maybe what some of us will be living in, a totally self-sufficient autonomous vehicle designed by Ted Bakewell. Some of you may be familiar with it. Recycles its water, the waste is recycled. Photovoltaic cells for electricity. Really very much the other end of the spectrum. Once more. Okay, sing along. Okay, well now while we're taking a brief intermission here. These first slides are really by way of a table of context, because the whole concept of using the environment around us to make a comfortable dwelling and to use as little alternate or conventional energy as possible has really changed very little, just the way in which it's manifested itself. And so this may be a discussion sans audiovisuals this evening. One of the things that we found interesting in the book that Mark mentioned was based on 4.5 years of research. And what you're seeing tonight is really an ongoing project studying indigenous design and climate design. And one of the interesting things we found was that not only had every major civilization in history used the sun as an energy source, but the reasons for it have always been the same. Major fuel crises, whether it's the Greeks, who suffered a very, very severe fuel crisis after they had denuded all of their local forests, wood being the major fuel source, or whether it's we in the industrial world who have really used up the cheap petroleum fuels that we've had in a very short period of time. That stimulus has always been the same, and the response has always been the same. People have looked around for alternative energy sources, and with regard to architecture, they've always done one thing. They start orienting their house, insulating it much better, and really doing more with less. Are we going to do more with less back there? That's it. Okay, perfect. That's good. All right, so remembering we just looked at the vehicle, this is a Greek solar city of the 5th century BC. every home within the city was oriented to the sun. They were spaced in such a way that none blocked the sun to the other. And this is sort of its modern day vestige. This is Davis, California, which in 1975 really became a prototype for this type of solar community. The earliest solar heated dwelling that I've been able to find, and what I think is really the earliest in history, was 6,000 years ago, and it was developed by the Chinese. Now, it was a partially subterranean adobe structure, and the only opening it had, which were not large, but door and a window combination, all fronted south. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a typical Neolithic village, beginnings of an agrarian society, and all of the openings face south. A very early awareness that the sun was a fundamental part of living structure. By the time rectilinear architecture came about, and really the prototype for architecture in the East thereafter, you also found that all the structures faced the south. In fact, there was a very specific ceremony where in the morning they would drive a gnomon in the ground. At sunrise, they would scribe a circle around this. At sunrise, the shadow would break the circle, they would mark it. At sunset, it would break the circle again, they would mark it. They would bisect it, and they knew where true south was, and then they would proceed and build a palace and the rest of the city. This is this is a Shang Dynasty city. This is about 2500 BC. This really set the tenor for this type of architecture in China. What evolved out of this was really the prototypical Asian house, the courtyard house. During the earlier dynasties, the main living rooms, which would be up to the top of the slide, were for the master, and his various wives would be to either side of him. And people of lesser importance, the children and servants, would be on the east and the west, and the main living room, again, facing south. Porticos on the south were very precisely calculated so that the sun wouldn't enter the structure. In the summertime, would help keep it cool. Yet in the winter, full exposure to the sun, which would enter all of the main living rooms and keep it very nicely warm. The beds in the sleeping part of the house would front right up against the south facade of the house. There was a translucent rice paper was the window structure, which is replaced annually in a ceremony. And the transmittance for solar energy is quite high for this material, and its insulation ability is remarkably close to glass. So really fairly effective. And the north side of the home was double walled. They had no insulation. In fact, in China today, they still have no insulation. So they would build two walls, and in between that would be straw and various insulating materials. So with very little to work with, they built a fairly sophisticated dwelling. One of the reasons for this, in fact, the principal reason, was the lack of fuel. Major fuel crises by the 5th century BC in China. China was once entirely forested, very thickly forested as the United States was, but through the centuries and slash and burn agriculture, ceremonial destruction of the forest to rid evil spirits, and the use of wood as a fuel source for heating had destroyed millions, literally millions of acres of wood. So by the 5th century, most of the land that surrounded the major cities in China was totally deforested. So the fuel sources had to come from quite a distance. As digging oil today from quite a distance, it made it very expensive. And so when you find cities like Chang'an, which at the time was the largest city in the world, every winter they faced an energy crisis. It was against the law to use wood as a fuel source. You had to just put on heavy clothes. People were arrested for denuding all of the decorative shrubs and trees within the city. It was so cold, and they were so desperate for fuel, they would just go along the boulevards and chop it down. If you were caught doing this, you were banished from the kingdom. That type of architecture and that impetus to use the sun as an energy source has continued all the way up to the present. This is in the Forbidden City in China, rice paper behind the lattice work, again solar oriented. There's another structure. This is a modern structure built on a commune. In northern China, barring a few of the structures built based on Russian influence really in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, all of the structures in China are passively solar designed, in such an extent that windows are only found on the south side. In most homes there are no windows on any other side of the house, and very thickly built mass walls on the east, west, and north sides, and quite plentiful windows on the south side, and the eaves are calculating. This is another structure built end to end. Most of the beds are built up against the south face to get the sunlight in. And you can see them, it's just amazing, one right after another, every place in northern China. And this is an aerial view of part of Peking, which is really today one of the largest cities in the world where all of the structures are solar oriented. Today China has a plan within the next decade to go back to these structures, insulate them, and add very inexpensive greenhouses onto the south side, one to increase solar heat gain and to also allow them to raise more food themselves, which is clearly a big problem in China. They're looking to supply the rural population of China, which is 80% of the total, entirely with renewable energy, electricity from wind power, water power, solar, and most of these homes have a methane gas digester so that their natural gas comes from human waste, vegetable waste, and animal waste. So really in the future it will be one of the few societies that's totally self-sufficient as far as energy. By the 6th century, the Japanese unified themselves. It became a country. The people were brought together under one political unit. And the first cities that they built, the first capital cities of Kyoto and Nara, were built and modeled after the Chinese cities of Chang'an. And also modeled was the indigenous architecture, the same thing the Chinese had done, totally passively designed. The Japanese have really used this very consistently up until the post-war era. And you'll find even some structures built in Japan in the 50s and 60s. These are single-loaded, one-room deep apartment buildings just outside of Tokyo. They all face south, all have very nice access to the sun. The awareness of using solar energy in Japan is phenomenal. A person who in this country would have no idea whatsoever about technology, and especially using energy for heating homes, their counterpart in Japan would very clearly realize that a home should be structured in this way to take the best advantage of the sun. Ironically, today Japan leads the world in the use of solar technology, photovoltaic cells. 11% of all of the homes in China have a solar water heater on it. That's close to 4 million solar water heaters. But ironically, to have started using this passive solar design architecture, they're behind just about every other industrialized country. This is one of the first homes that they're building of a sort of new generation of solar homes. But their attitude is that it is a trend. And this is one of the things I want to point out when we go further, is that they've moved away from the traditional architecture. They built a few of these, and right now they're at a transition. They still see solar very much as a trend and may eventually move away from it. In this house, a greenhouse on the south facade allows for a great deal of solar heat gain. You can see the very dark blue tiles are used very appropriately aesthetically, but they also are very functional in absorbing and storing the solar heat. They also make very good use of daylighting and solar gain to the house through skylights and clerestories. This is more of the type of the house that the Japanese are using as far as passive solar. These are not cheap. The piece of land that this house will be built upon is about $250,000, and the house is about $275,000. So real estate is more expensive other places than Los Angeles. But a very simple design, takes full advantage of solar access. The roof structure itself acts as an eave, and probably 70% of the heating needs comes from the sun. This is an ad from a developer who is really pitching solar, and has gotten a fairly good response so far. This is an apartment building from the 5th century Greece. Very contemporary looking by modern standards. Totally solar design. The West, as well as the East, has a very long history in designing structures for the sun. As in China, entire cities from the 5th century BC on, all new cities built in classical Greece were all solar designed. And the reason was that, like China, Greece was very thickly forested, but also like China and other civilizations after this, wood was the main fuel source. It was used for home construction, for ship construction, furniture. In a way, it was like oil. Oil is a byproduct for plastics and a broad range of things that we use in an industrial society. Wood in these days was the petroleum, a very multi-purpose resource. And so as the population grew and they used more and more of the wood, it meant that wood as a fuel was no longer economic. So Socrates in the 5th century recommends building this, so does Aristotle. Very much the housing type of the period. This is the city of Herculaneum, which is south of Naples. It was originally a Greek city. As you can see, it was all laid out on a grid pattern, oriented south. But in the 1st century BC, it was taken over by the Romans. And the Romans had a very much a different attitude toward using the sun politically. And that was that in the older section of the city, up at the top, they subdivided all of the homes, which were quite large. Average Greek home was about 3,200 square feet. It was a large interior courtyard, very large rooms. And they subdivided all of those homes, so the working class Romans were stuffed really into very, very small little apartments. Had no regard whatsoever for the sun. Yet down here, in the newer part of the city, you had very large solar villas. So essentially, if you had money, if you were one of the elite, you had a solar home. If you were one of the working class, not a chance. One of the other things that came about was that window glass, something that we obviously all take for granted, was developed by the Romans in the 1st century. And they had started out building structures based on this Greek design, and as they were able to build window panes larger and larger, they started glazing the windows, and immediately found out that it was not only, the rooms not only got warmer because the wind wasn't blowing through, but they found that glass was a solar heat trap. And so that very simple discovery totally transformed architecture in Rome. In fact, if you go through Vitruvius's 10 books of architecture, it is loaded with examples on how to build solar homes. They would section together pieces of glass. They could build them 2 feet by about 4 feet, section them together so large south facades would allow the sun to come in. Huge bathing public baths like this one, the Baths of Diocletian, which in the main public bathing area held 1,200 people, were all solar heated. Because to heat these things, they were having to pitch in entire trees, things 3-4 feet in diameter, 20 feet long, one right after another into the furnaces to heat these. Whereas when they discovered that glass trapped solar heat, these immense glass windows provided the majority of the heat. And Rome was finding that they were becoming very politically vulnerable by depending so much on wood as a fuel. All of their metals, shipbuilding, homes, all the rest of that. And like the crisis we had in '73, they had a fleet of wood ships that went to North Africa, into France, and brought back this wood. Now, to protect that, they had to really increase military expenditures so that their vulnerability wouldn't, so they wouldn't be too vulnerable. And as they increased military expenditures, they had to increase taxation. That devalued the currency and helped to throw the Roman economy into a tailspin. People started to flee the cities. And you had the wealthier people first building self-sufficient rural villas. Palladius Faventinius write how to make the tiles, how to grind up charcoal, put it into the tiles of the floor so that it will absorb more solar heat. And they said it also would hide the wine stains and be very comfortable on the feet of your servants. And you also found that they had special sunrooms. This is the south side, that's a large garden area. But they had special sunrooms which were called heliocaminas, which is solar furnace. And in the wintertime, the master of the estate would spend most of his time in there, totally glazed, and the temperatures, tests have shown later, were in the 80s in the middle of the wintertime when it was fairly cold outside. By the 3rd century, the Romans passed sun rights laws, which simply stated that anyone who built a structure to be solar heated had the right to the sun. No one had the right to come and block your sun afterward. If they did, you either could charge them what you felt was appropriate, or they had to remove their home. This is something that people are still discussing today. Is sun rights law something that we should have? Can we really implement them? The Romans did it in the 3rd century and kept it really up until the 8th century. This is a close-up of the heliocaminas, totally solar heated. With the fall of the empire, you found through the Dark Ages that large windows, especially large glass windows, were about the last thing you wanted. Some marauding group of warriors marching through your house. So very little attention to solar access was given. And it was interesting, by the 16th and 17th century, you found that Renaissance is starting to begin in Europe. People are starting to settle down again, feeling a little more comfortable about life. And you find the reemergence of this idea of allowing people to have access to the sun. There were laws called, there was a statute called the Grumble Law, which essentially said that no one could block your access to the sun. And the way you could determine as if you weren't getting enough sunlight is if in reading normal text you began to grumble because you couldn't see it. That meant that your light was cut off, and so you could have him tear his building down, or he owed you some sort of recompense for that. So this was sort of the beginning of that reawakening. By the 19th century, the industrialization of Europe, you found the aristocracy very much in tune with the sun. Glass had been rediscovered as a solar heat trap, and you found architects like Humphrey Repton saying that why have a dismal home like this when you can have one with a conservatory, you can have your friends over, have a big party, and take advantage of the solar heat. And most architectural manuals at the time said that if you weren't interested in saving money, then pay no regard whatsoever to the orientation of your structure. But if you were, that you should very carefully solar orient it. Again, this is where the working class lived. Solar orientation was not a big thing for them at all. And interestingly, it really wasn't until the mid-1800s when disease and epidemics threatened the existence of most industrial cities that a housing reform movement came about. And they said, well, we better really do something about this housing because we'll end up paying the price. And part of that Garden Cities movement, Getty's, Unwin, and that whole thing was incorporated the whole idea of solar access, the access to wind and light. Legislation in Germany and England and France regulated that homes had to be spaced far enough apart to have access to the sun. One of the first ones was Port Sunlight in Liverpool, and this was built by the Lever brothers. And compared to the industrial slums, this was paradise. This is the first time that a working class estate was built where the homes were spaced far enough apart, and most of the main living rooms had access to the sun. This is a view of this. As they did this, they glazed the windows, and again they rediscovered that, that the sun can help to heat a home. So you find Raymond Unwin and various other architects like French architect Augustin Rey starting to study the sun. Where is it? What's its location in various parts of the year, various parts of the day, how much heat is represented by a surface that the sun shines on. Architectural manuals start recommending that buildings be spaced far enough apart so as not to block sunlight to one another. And so you have this sort of renaissance of this movement again, building cities very much like the Greeks had. Tony Garnier in 1918 introduced the idea for his Cité Industriale. And one of the aspects of it was that every home was to face south. Every home was to be spaced far enough apart. There was to be green spaces. Very much a human scale to it, and very much a full awareness of the environment. The only problem is that most people still lived in the city, industry was in the city, and they found that to satisfy this kind of ratio, that you really couldn't do it. The buildings were too close together. And so a movement came up really to outlaw real estate speculation, land speculation, because studies had shown us that throughout history, speculation on land had always led to the deterioration of the quality of life. As the price of real estate kept going higher and higher, buildings got closer and closer together, quality of the air was worse, you had very little sunlight, disease was higher, physical ailments were higher. So they said until we can really have a great deal of space and access to space in the city, we'll never be able to build cities like this. And it was really after World War I and the beginning of the Weimar Republic in Germany that this was able to happen. Namely because the economy was totally decimated, as you remember, in Germany. And so you found the government and housing cooperatives, a very important point in history where very large cooperative movement in Europe went in and bought land, huge tracts of land throughout Germany. And you found architects at the beginning of the Bauhaus school and the whole questioning and reappraisal of architecture and the dwellings we live in. And one of the major tenets of the Bauhaus was solar orientation, fuel conservation. Fuel was still fairly expensive, in short supply after the war. And into the Bauhaus architects, they figured we'll build all of these apartment structures. This is Siemensstadt, which is a subdivision in Berlin. And they decided they would build all of the apartment structures on an east-west, or on a north-south axis. So that in the morning, the sun rises in the east, and the eastern side of the buildings get maximum exposure to the sun. And in the afternoon, the sun is on the west, and the western side gets access to the sun. So it was a very egalitarian attitude. The only problem was, and it was quite surprising in retrospect, was that they had no idea of the shift in the sun and how drastic it was. So that in the wintertime, at approximately 52 degrees north latitude, the only area of this building that got sun was the end of it. Yet in the summertime, the sun was so intense on the eastern side that by 10 in the morning, the shades had to be drawn to block it out. And then in the afternoon, it became an oven in there. You had the ambient temperature of the day built up, the sun blistering in there. You had glass windows. So they were living in solar furnaces. This is after they built well over a dozen of these kind of communities. So this is what the structure looks like. So they started, in the ones that were existing, they put deciduous trees along the west and east sides of the building to protect them some. And by 1935, nearly all of these large apartment dwellings were turned around to face the southwest, so that, like the Japanese had built, single-loaded apartments, so everyone would get access to the sun in the winter and keep it out in the summer.
Also in 32, they started analyzing the economics of building large apartment houses. And architect by the name of Hugo Haring decided that maybe small duplexes, single and double family residences, might be a better idea. And so he developed for the Werkbund exhibition in Vienna for 32 this prototype solar home, which later became very popular. Long and narrow, all the secondary service rooms were to the north. Closets, kitchens, bathrooms, what have you. Very few small windows high on the north side. All of the main living area was on the south. And as you can see, very heavily glazed on the south side. And what's very popular in Europe is the extended awnings. So that in the summertime, the awnings were extended, blocked the sun from coming in. In the wintertime, the sun would come directly in. This idea was this was introduced in 32, and by 34, it was really starting to become quite popular. Hilberseimer and a number of the other German architects of note were beginning to lay out city models based on this idea, and they were starting to build them. The only problem is that Hitler didn't care for them too much. Not so much that he was against solar, but it turns out that all of these structures that were designed this way were designed by housing cooperatives, social bodies that were, you had a very large group of people in one area. And this was very much a political problem for Hitler. So he set Speer out to mount a very massive campaign against modern architecture. No decent German would live under a flat roof, quote unquote. And numerous other little slogans like that. And essentially what they did was they killed the modern housing movement in Germany and really set all of these working class people out into the rural countryside to build traditional thatched roof structures, and that was really their only means of support, was building their own housing. And once they were out there, they were diffused as a political threat. The movement did, however, carry on in other parts of Europe. This is 200 solar condos built out just outside of Zurich in 1932, still lived in today. Very beautiful passive solar design. A similar development built in 32 just outside of Stockholm. So the real basis in the modern architectural movement, in the Bauhaus movement, I remember before he died I interviewed Marcel Breuer, was clearly, from the energy standpoint, the solar orientation was very much an aspect that they were interested in. And this whole idea really spread throughout Europe and later to the United States. About this same time, two architects commissioned by the Royal Institute of British Architects to help designers build with regard to the sun developed the heliodon. This is one of the first heliodons developed in 32. With that was a whole series of graphs and charts to help designers know, depending on the latitude that they were building, to know exactly where the sun was. You place your model here, set the light at the particular time of the year, and rotate it. In fact, in London at this time, real estate, as the awareness for the sun became more prevalent, any rental property that faced other than south, the rates just went through the floor. But if you had south-facing real estate property, you could rent it for just about anything you liked. That kind of consciousness for using the sun. Traditional architecture throughout Europe is always reflected in awareness toward the climate. Such things as windows to the south, deciduous vines, so that in the wintertime they lose their leaves and the sun goes in when the windows are open. Yet in the summertime, those things are very thickly vegetated and it blocks the sun from coming in. This is a home that I visited last fall, which is somewhat reflective of the attitude in France today and in many parts of Europe, is this renaissance of this idea of using the sun. This is quite an old farmhouse, stone farmhouse. I'm not sure the period. I think he was saying that it was about 200 years old. And Michel Gerbert, who's quite a well-known French architect, totally restructured it, put a solar greenhouse on the south side, glazed the entire south facade. And the building was all was facing south anyway because it was built properly to begin with. Put heat storage tubes onto the interior and really kept the aesthetic, but also made it a very functional home, and one that has inspired numerous other architects throughout Europe to consider the whole concept of redesigning many existing structures. This is a development outside of Nice, hillside property, a lot of it very difficult to build upon. You're finding a growing interest in underground housing and subterranean housing that's all oriented to the south and tiered up upon one another. So you've got very complete insulation on the east, west, and north walls, and total solar exposure. Something like this one. This is a structure just outside of Madrid. So there's very much a reawakening of this idea in Europe now. In fact, the EEC, unlike our government, which has pulled back from promoting this type of architecture, is sponsoring architectural competitions throughout Europe, the common market countries, competitions where designers are paid for their designs, the structures are built, such as this. This is a competition, and the structure is built outside of Paris, to where very, very inexpensive, these are about $30,000 homes. And they were essentially, the rule said it had to at least get half of its heat from the sun, and cost about $30,000. This is kind of dark, but so the government's sponsoring it. People are starting to regenerate this interest. In this country, we've clearly have just as long a history as the Europeans do and as the Asians do. By the 11th century, quite a large number of the Pueblo dwellings in the southwestern United States were all oriented very appropriately to the sun. Ralph Knowles of USC has studied these and determined that in the summertime, 1/4 of the heat comes through the ceiling. It's very heavily insulated with straw and mud, and yet the west wall, or the south-facing wall, which is pure adobe, gets 1/3 of the heat in the wintertime. So that just by using orientation, very simple building materials, they were able to make a very livable structure. Spanish, as they began to move in and colonialize this part of the country, took up the adobe architecture, brought some of their own design concepts, as well as using the Indians' concepts. Most of these homes face south. Most of the windows on the south had shutters for insulating, eaves that came off of the south side that protected it in the summer, used vines for cooling. So very effective indigenous design. In the northeast of the United States, the salt box, which is really built here since the 17th century and was a very popular housing type, is typical of, again, that indigenous type of architecture. This is from a plan sold by a mercantile company in the late 1800s. Very low swept northern roof acts as a spoiler to buffer the cold winter winds. Majority of the windows are placed on the south. Deciduous vines help to keep the house cool in summer and let the sun in the winter. Interestingly, though, as the United States began to industrialize and buildings started to really rise in height, a Boston architect, that's in backwards, but a Boston architect by the name of Atkinson started to realize that this is Back Bay, Boston, and he drew a plan that showed that a 300-foot skyscraper, which was the type that was being built in New York and the type that was being considered to be built in other parts of the country, that one structure on a winter day would shade that much area, all of this being residential. And his contention was that one building would not really cause that much damage, but when you started to build rows of these skyscrapers, which was quite common, becoming common in Chicago, Minneapolis, and certainly in New York City, that then the impact to the residential area was quite severe. And he was actually doing a study for hospitals, and he found that, as they had found in Europe, that people's health went down and various other qualities of life went down. So he made a proposal before the Boston City Council. They passed a law, which was essentially a sunrise law, regulated the heights of buildings relevant to the widths of streets. Other cities that did that were Montreal, Baltimore, Cleveland, St. Louis, St. Paul also picked up that concept of regulating the height of building to allow solar access. And by the 20s, even New York began to become concerned about this, and a study they commissioned on how best to build housing projects by Charles Goodrich, what he called his sunshine development, took into full consideration this whole idea of a solar design village. This was never built, and as most of you are well aware, that whole attitude in architecture totally died. And it really wasn't until the Bauhaus movement, the modern architecture movement, came to the United States that the interest in passive solar architecture really took hold. This building was built in 1940 by Chicago architect George Fred Keck. Keck was lucky in that one of the problems that European designers had was tremendous heat loss. The larger expanses of glass you had, the greater the heat loss, especially in northern climates. In '35, Libby Owens Ford came out with thermopane glass, double pane insulated glass. This meant that in the Chicago area, which is bitter cold in the wintertime, that he could use this much glass and still not have tremendous heat loss. The other thing he did that the Europeans, that's inverted, didn't do is, instead of using a canvas awning, which is, again, is quite popular in Europe, he calculated a fixed awning. He felt that if you oriented your home properly, calculated the length of your eave, you could choose the season that you wanted, and the sun would come in appropriately. And this is an interior shot of this home in the wintertime. Now, one of the things he hadn't counted upon was that the radiant heating value of using the sun. One of the things that most of his clients really accepted, most of us have accepted, is that in heating systems which use forced air, which would grow in popularity from this point on, was very uncomfortable. Most of the material in the house would be cold to the touch, and the air would be warm, so you have a very unpleasant sensation. Hot against cold, hot against cold. In all of these solar homes, everyone was elated in that the air temperature could be rather cool in the 60s, yet everything within the house was radiating heat. So you could walk around barefooted. The sofa was radiating heat, the carpet, the walls, the floor, everything. So not only were the people who lived in these homes saving money, but they really enjoyed the comfort of living in a home that was heated that way. And they also, and I've interviewed some of them, started to really talk almost in spiritual terms about having a home that faced due south and watching the sun go through the seasons year after year. The trees get lush and green in the spring, and then in the summertime block the sun out, and you go back. This is the summertime, keeps the sun out totally. And then in the wintertime, the trees lose their leaves and the sun comes in. And it's something that's so simple, but having lived in it, most people that have lived in this type of home could never live in another one. So that encouraged him to do more. This home cost less than $1,000 more than a conventional home in 1940. It's been saving over 30%, poorly insulated by today's standards, been saving over 30% of its energy for the last 42 years. And it's still a very effective home. In '41, Keck built Solar Park, the first solar subdivision in the United States. Bankers would not loan money for flat-roofed modern homes. So they took this sort of modern architecture, the idea of solar design, threw a gabled roof on it, and they were able to build them. The fellow who built this built half of the subdivision with the solar homes and the other half with conventional, New England, colonial, that type of thing. And these things sold out immediately. The public response was tremendous. Unfortunately, this was 41. The war broke out in the latter part of that year. And the movement really had to wait until after the war. And what you found was that during the war, housing magazines became somewhat popular reading. And fully 30% of all the homes depicted in architectural and housing magazines during the war were all passive design solar homes. Museum of Modern Art in New York had a contest. Philip Johnson, Frank Lloyd Wright, a number of other well-known architects all submitted beautiful passive solar design homes. Philip Johnson today, in fact, doesn't think too much of solar, but he was very much into it then. And so it was a very strong movement. Very much consciousness of solar was quite high. So that after the war, when we were faced with a tremendous housing shortage, we'd gone from about 100,000 starts a year during the war to over 1.5 million after the war. You found a large number of developers building solar homes. Many of them prefabricated solar homes like this one, which would be site assembled in one day and used some very innovative design techniques. These were all modular panels fit together, very nicely fit for cross ventilation. It had panels at the top and at the bottom of each wall to allow summertime ventilation to go through. It would go through and come out the high part of the north side of the house. Very few, very much like the German model, very few windows on the north side of the house. There was a 1-inch pond of water on the top of the house, which acted as evaporative cooling in the summertime. And the south side was totally glazed, so that took full advantage of the sun. This house sold for under $4,000. And unfortunately, this is what we ended up with. One of the reasons was that this house is actually a fairly popular housing type, and even as late as 51, the Levitz brothers had adopted this type of a house as their model. The only problem is they took it, they copied it identically, and went into a typical subdivision and built the homes around the block, so that 1/4 were properly oriented and the other 3/4 were improperly oriented. So someone would buy, in fact, the publisher of my book was looking at the book and just said, wow, that's no wonder our solar house didn't work. It was facing north. And that level of consciousness didn't exist. People really saw large glass windows as picture windows, bay windows. The glass companies really pushed that. And so the whole idea of the functional aspect, which was the basis for this type of architecture, was lost, and people started building these glass houses. And Philip Johnson himself added to that with his new Canaan house and more glass. By the 50s, energy started to get relatively cheap here, so you no longer were people interested in saving energy, which they had been during the war. So we find this kind of architecture, the kind that's everywhere here in Los Angeles. This was built in the 50s. This guy is probably one of the handful, literally, maybe 5 or 6 in the United States, that wanted to build a passive home at this time. There just was, no one was doing it. This is in Aspen, Colorado. He's been living in it since the 50s, and it's a wonderful structure. We had to wait until really the 70s. This was built in 1975. Had some innovative techniques worked into it. You have so-called sky lids, these louvered skylights on the ceiling, which when they heat up from the sun, they open, let the sun come in to heat the house. In the evening when they cool, they automatically close and reflect the heat back into the house. And it's all oriented properly. And again, by 75, You have Davis, California sort of setting the tenor for the idea of mass-built, energy-efficient homes. And this is the kind of thing that's evolving as developer-built functional architecture. And this is Bakewell's dream of where we might be going. Now, the idea is that solar really obviously isn't a trend. It goes beyond a trend. And the real question today is how do you take these ideas of simplicity, of climate design, and make them aesthetically pleasing, which is obviously what most of your job is, and is what the biggest argument of solar is that most of the people who have distinguished themselves to this point in this type of architecture have been really quite awful designers. And it's fit into that genre kind of architecture. You're a solar architect, you're not a good architect. And so that attitude of taking good climate design, awareness of the environment, the simplicity of design, and making it aesthetic is essential. And in this country, we're really falling prey to that whole idea of a trend very much. In Europe, they're taking a very serious attitude toward this, a very slow forward motion about using this kind of architecture. And I think in the United States, it's still perceived as, well, it was nice, now let's move on to something else. And I think that it cannot be denied that it's a global trend, and that it's something that really should be incorporated into all design. That's really, I guess, all I had to say is to really kind of bring this perspective of this type of architecture and how long and how deeply embedded in the roots of architecture it is, and how the energy crises over the various years have drawn us to it and away from it, and encourage us to use it more. So if there are any questions, thank you. If there are any questions.
I wonder if you could go into that a bit more, and how, in terms of, if you stop land speculation, does that mean totally, or does that mean in certain areas? Or, I know that right now the Citizens Party has got a thing on the, some kind of legislation that a certain amount of housing, just residential housing, wouldn't be available for land speculation. I'm thinking about these 400-year-old family homes in England and so forth. People in the family feel like investing in improving on it and so forth. Can you imagine that?
Yeah, what I wasn't endorsing the idea of outlawing land speculation, even though I may not personally agree with it. But really what they had recognized, and I think what people are recognizing now, is proper zoning, really, and the proper use of land. I think as far as urban development, Ralph Knowles at the University of Southern California is doing some very interesting work with the idea of a solar envelope. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, essentially you take a site, no matter where it is, and you let the sun describe the geometry of that site. And the various angles of the sun throughout the year create this so-called solar envelope. And what the designers are doing is, once they have this geometry, which does not impede upon any other structure surrounding it, and is its own geometry with regard to access to the sun, then they fill it up with the building. And what I've seen, and what people are recognizing more and more, is that you have some, just by that description of that envelope, some fascinating designs. Because what they do is they build these almost pyramid-looking shapes right up to fit very tightly within this imaginary envelope. And so that type of zoning does not really ban real estate or land speculation. What it does is it makes the most use of the least space. And in fact, Knowles has found that with his solar envelope design method, they're getting much higher densities than is what is common in most urban development presently. So it's that whole idea, which Mark mentioned at first, of really doing more with less. It's saying, for the first time in history, we can now use knowledge as our most valuable tool. And that's the whole basis of doing more with less, is to say we can understand the environment to an incredible extent. We have all of these materials and tools at our disposal. Let's make a house that once it's situated, once it's built properly, will function perfectly thereafter. When
Isn't it true that land that come in and bulldoze the whole thing instead of something that's more fast?
You know, I think zoning is really part of it, and it's the one aspect that government really holds a great deal of responsibility. And as I was pointing out, the Romans had realized that almost 2,000 years ago, that it was a valuable resource, it was a proper way to build a home, and that if someone built that home, then they should have a right not to have that aspect of their home destroyed. And so, and the law worked very perfectly for hundreds of years. And other manifestations of that carried on even into Europe. The Ancient Lights Law has been used in London really up until the present day. So it's really a matter of government should not get, I don't think the government should get too involved, but as far as zoning and allowing us at least that much access, I think it's very important. And I don't think that it really impinges upon anyone else's rights. In fact, it's making better use of what we've got instead of building these things that really take very little use of the environment.
What do you think about the new Title 24 as far as the awareness of public?
Well, one of the problems is that, and it's one thing I faced, I was working with an architectural group in town, and California was one of the first states in the Union to pass a law, and the Title 24 was part of that package, requiring, it was called Solar Act. Developers who did that seemed to be quite pleased. The only problem is that, ironically, the city building department here threw out, we were doing reports that were maybe 50 pages with very specific recommendations, had an economic breakdown, very specific architectural recommendations, and the rest of that. And they were throwing them out and saying, all we want is 2 pages. The first page is a title page, and the second page is saying that everything's okay. And so when the client comes back and say, well, why did I pay you to do this when the city doesn't want it, it totally defeated the whole purpose of that. So one of the important things is in the areas of legislation which will help to promote this type of thing, it has to be sponsored. I mean, people have to go to the building department and say, yeah, it really is a good thing. I mean, and the developers that did use it were quite pleased because they could go to potential clients in a growing, in a tighter housing market and say, look, it's not only an aesthetically pleasing home, but it's very energy efficient. So they found, those who did use it, that it was easier for them to sell homes, but if you don't have to do it, it's much easier not to. So there are many good laws there. It's just a matter of, is the building department enforcing them? And in Los Angeles, they haven't. Cities like Palo Alto and Santa Clara, they have. So it becomes somewhat of a political discussion at that point.
When solar cells come down to about 50 cents a kilowatt, where do you think the best place would be to place them in a single house assembly?
Well, I didn't throw a slide in here, but it's interesting is that there was there's a magazine called New Shelters that I saw. I think it's this month's issue that points out that in California right now there are close to 400 homes that are solar electric. Now, most of those are dope growers in Northern California, but the point is that they're becoming more and more cost effective, and essentially what they're doing, and is what Arco Solar has patented, is they're using it as a shingle, really as a roofing membrane. And they essentially take the silicone cells, cover them embedded in a Teflon material, which supposedly has fairly good life, and really just covering the roof with it. And the ones I've seen, I don't. Again, it's the same problem with the early solar homes. Aesthetically, no one has really, I think, tackled that. It's strictly from a functional standpoint. They're really thrown on there. But I would say Arco Solar had planned to, by '86, to start advertising and commercially marketing photovoltaic cells to urban dwellers. And my thinking is that it'll be before that, because the Japanese are putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the U.S. market. And so I think that the price is going to come down much quicker. I think probably by '84, you're going to start seeing more and more. If you think that there's 400 in California right now alone, and probably another 400 in other parts of the United States. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, hi, how you doing? How are you? No, it's not really here. I thought I was coming over tonight. I thought I go wrong. Oh, really? Yeah. Usually. Good, yeah. Have you seen Noriko at all lately? No. Not right now. She was here. Oh, yeah. Well, no, she's back now. We're taking a group. We're taking a group to Europe in September to look at some of those developments. You should wrangle your way to come.
But it was wonderful. Where do you do what you do? You live here in SCI-Arc?
No, yeah, right. I live in Santa Monica. My daughter